I'm really happy to have this session with all of you. I do have a small presentation, but I do want to say it's only going to serve as a backdrop. I'd like everyone to participate, be interactive. Some of the best learning happens when we talk to each other, when we ask questions, when we challenge assumptions, when we have a really good time inquiring, right? I'm an IB teacher. I've been an IB teacher for almost 18 years now. And the biggest thing that we as teachers learn along with our students is that we always need to be inquirers, right? We are always on this journey of learning, and thus we should question information, we should assimilate as much information and knowledge as we can, but in a critical way, in an inquiring manner. And that is what I hope to leave you all with today: be inquirers, right? So what I'm going to do is I'll share the screen, but again, this has to be interactive. I need you all to talk. Please don't hesitate to question me, speak up, challenge what I say, because like I already said, that's what makes it interesting. How do I know, or how do you know what you know? Can I get any responses from anyone? I know 2 plus 2 is 4. I know a bit of geography. I know a bit of facts. I know that the earth goes around the sun. But how do I know this? And this question is very, very deceptively simple, because when you start asking yourself these questions, you begin to think, yeah, I don't really know it. This is something my parents always told me. This is something my teacher said. My friends were discussing this. And so because they said it and I like my friends, it must be true. But to answer the question, how do I know what I know, is much more difficult than what it is. All right. Like I said, Venkatesh, if you see a hand raise, or if I see a hand raise from anyone, please stop me so that I can address the question that you have.
Yeah, Joshua says from Google.
From Google,
the
yes.
answer. Yeah.
Yes, that is, Joshua is just like my students. When we put this question out, we know it from Google. So my next question, or as the talk progresses, we will try and understand, is Google all that reliable? If I type something in Google and it shows me something, am I going to believe it immediately? And that, I think, should be the guiding statement, the guiding question of this presentation. So I'm beginning with what we all are very familiar with as we are getting more and more digital, and that is, how does misinformation work? Misinformation works very, very, very easily. Part of it is because the way our brains are structured. Part of it is because of the society and the culture that we are in, the people that we interact with. And as Joshua said, when I get information from Google algorithms. One exercise that I do with my English students, I do this with my TOK grade 11 and 12 students, and my psychology 11 and 12 students, is this. And this is not original. It's not something that I thought up on my own. It's something I found while I was doing research. And that is, if you type in, for example, I told my students to type in rich person on a Google search engine and told them to click on images. Now, if you have your phones next to you and you type in rich person and click on images, remember, I've used the word person, not man, not woman, right? But the things that get thrown up are white men in suits, right? You have to count at least 6 to 7 white men before you find a woman, and even more if you have to look for a person of color, right? So this is just how a Google algorithm works. It contributes to a lot of the misinformation that we have today, right? So some of the things that I want to talk and I want to hear from you all is, why do we take reports at face value? If I read a headline, right, I tend not to, or tend not to read the whole article. Why does that happen? Anyone? Come on, I want to hear from you all. Okay, I'm sure that you'll all warm up a little more as we progress, but we tend to...
Sharmi says confirmation bias.
Thank you.
Before this, Anjali Goel said, we learn by listening, reading, and through assumptions.
Yes, Absolutely. So I'm talking to an audience that really knows a lot about the way things work in media already, right? We do tend to take reports at face value. Many reasons for this. If I called one of my psychology students and asked them to explain to you why, they would say it's because we are hardwired, right? We are evolutionarily predisposed to take a quick route. It's called a system one thinking, right? System one thinking is quick, it's intuitive. You don't really want to think something through because you are programmed to save energy. You are programmed to use that energy for other things. So if you read a headline, no matter how misinformation filled it is, you tend to believe it, right? Another thing, as you said, are our confirmation biases. We tend to look at information through our lenses and only look for things that prove our point and disregard things that don't, right? So this especially impacts students, and I found this in my experience both in middle school and in high school when we ask students to look up information. In my school, we do a certain extent of teaching, but a lot of what we encourage our students to do is independent research. And almost always, until the students have got a hang of it, they have taken information, A, that adheres to their confirmation biases, B, it's just taken at face value, the report is not read. We have students going to websites that are biased, we have students going to websites that are out and out fake, right? Which brings me to the next point. We tend not to question our sources. And this is becoming a huge problem, especially in the last 5 to 8 years, because we have a lot of websites, we have a lot of other digital sources that look very, very good. They are well designed. They use the right kind of language. If these are science-based websites, they use scientific terms, use phrases like clinical trials have shown and research has proved that. So we tend not to have the time to double check that on our own. We say, oh, if someone is saying and using so many words, it must be true, right? Again, this is an exercise that I've done with my students where I made them go to a website that was called Nature News. I'm not very sure, I don't remember that. But it had a lot of links to a lot of pieces of research that when you read would make you think, this seems so genuine, this seems so authentic. No one is going to write an abstract and have an aim of an experiment and a hypothesis and then it's fake. It's just not possible. But it was a very right wing, very anti every science that we can think of website, and it was only showing misinformation. So when your students, when your children, especially now that schools are online and we have this whole COVID crisis that is forcing you all to sort of step in and become in loco teachers in a manner of speaking, you have to help your children question sources, right? One very easy way to find out if a website is questionable is it has a lot of advertisement on it. Lots of pop-ups and a lot of things are distracting you from the main content that is there, right? But at the same time, if you're researching, if your child is researching a specific topic, encourage them to go beyond Wikipedia. I tell all my students that if they put something in their bibliography that's a Wikipedia link, I don't accept it. So what I mean by this is use Wikipedia as a stepping stone. Read it, get a gist of what you're researching for from there, but please move on beyond that because Wikipedia is reliable to an extent, but not to a complete extent, right? What do you think I mean when I say we mistake narrative logic for fact? Anyone? Narrative logic for fact.
There is opinion in it rather than facts, and that opinion actually appeals to a confirmation bias.
Exactly, exactly. So that is again a problem that we face. I'm sorry, this seems to have gone, and no matter what I'm doing, never mind. That's all right. So we mistake narrative logic for fact because we want to adhere to something that fulfills and uses confirmation bias. Again, why is this? Why can we as a human species not deal with cognitive dissonance? Anyone? Why? What is cognitive dissonance? If there's any science or psychology person out there, take a guess. Come on, I don't like silence. Cognitive dissonance, to put it, yeah, please go on.
Cognitive dissonance is when we cannot put things together logically. We are not able to say A equals B, B equals C. So we cannot realize that A is actually equal to C. It's caused through a number of conditions, problems, and sometimes substances. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And to add to that, our beliefs, when they get challenged, right? If I'm believing something and there's a dissonance in my belief, when something is shown to me to be what I believe to be something else, my brain is not able to reconcile two differing opinions, and it tends to stick to what I had already believed in, right? So all of us at some point or the other face cognitive dissonance, and I'm sure that you can all think of examples in our modern history, whether it's the COVID epidemic, whether it's the results of various elections all around the world. These have really challenged our belief systems, and to a very large extent have made us realize that we all have experienced cognitive dissonance, right? I'm sorry, my presentation seems to have a mind of its own, but now it's working, right? So as has already been addressed, we allow confirmation bias to fool us, right? It's very easy. A lot of my students initially, now they don't dare to because I pounce on them and say that's confirmation bias. But in the first few months of a theory of knowledge class, if any of you have children in the IB diploma, their confirmation bias is very, very strong. And it really hits them when they see that they are being challenged, they don't like being challenged, but when they are challenged and when they get other perspectives and when they begin to accept that there are other perspectives, it really drives home the dangers of a confirmation bias. So you can just think about the number of times on your Facebook feed, on the media you use to access your news, you look for articles or you share articles or you tend to talk about stories and articles that adhere to your confirmation bias. So maybe the next time you can question yourself and say, wait a minute, I need to research a little more into this and I need to understand a little more before I end up making a decision, right? And of course, further to what I said, we are, as human beings, we are cognitive misers, right? We don't want to waste brain energy in doing research. It's not programmed into us evolutionarily. So most of the time, when we experience a cognitive dissonance, when we experience confirmation bias, when we spread misinformation, click the share button and pass it on, or as is so famously known, the WhatsApp university, we pass on stuff. Most of the time, we don't know enough about the topic, but something intuitive, and that is your confirmation bias, tells us this has to be true, this has to be correct, let's pass it on. And this can also happen because a lot of our beliefs are culturally entrenched, and we also tend to believe sources of authority that we relate to, sources of authority that we have confidence in. And that is why you can see in our country, in the United States, in many countries across the world, an opinion that is given by a person in power and authority is considered more significant and more meaningful than if it's given by a person who's actually qualified in the field. This brings me to another question that I have for all of you. Knowledge from authority, right? As a teacher, I'm giving information to my students. As an expert in neurology, someone is giving a TED talk on the brain and how it functions. To what extent should we rely on knowledge given by authority? And if we do, what are the potential problems over there? Why can knowledge from an authority figure be problematic?
Because of conflict of interest. Many of them have entrenched interests in not wanting all the facts to come out at all the time, especially politicians.
Yes, yes, exactly. But you hear this sort of very authoritarian, confident voice. It's you, that person is using language that you can relate to, is saying things that you can relate to, and so you don't. Right? One of um, one of the things that really hit home for me and a lot of my students were a few studies that we looked at in psychology for the past 2 or 3 years. Um, this study was done by a psychiatrist in the late 60s, the early 60s, I think. Anyway, so what he wanted to prove was that clinicians, mental health experts tend to misdiagnose and tend to make mistakes when giving a label, especially to a mental illness, right? And so he conducted this experiment, wrote a whole study on it of how he and a few of his students checked themselves into a mental health facility, claiming that they could hear sounds and voices. And they said, look, we keep hearing this voice thud or boom, and we are checking ourselves in because obviously we are experiencing a delusion. But the moment they had checked themselves in, they claimed that they'd stopped hearing these voices. But the mental health specialists in that hospital did not release, did not allow them to be discharged, for some for a week, some for over 20 days, because the provisional label that was given to these pseudo patients was delusional schizophrenia, and schizophrenia with delusions, and therefore they could not be released, even though they started behaving in perfectly normal ways when they were there for the whole duration of their stay. What the study proved was that the more something is suggested to you, the more something is explained to you, and if it fits the narrative, you're going to believe it, even an expert like a psychiatrist. So that's fantastic. It's a published research. It's something that I won't be surprised if a lot of universities still use as an example of how difficult it is to diagnose mental illness. Just this year, I read that this particular psychiatrist had not spoken the entire truth. The article was extremely biased. He had fabricated certain parts of it. He had, for example, the pseudo patients who had checked themselves in, had not just heard the word thud. They claimed that they had heard a whole lot of other things and a whole lot of other voices. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, no matter how scientific that particular study looked, today we know that it's just misinformation, right? So that is how powerful misinformation is, that even universities and schools can retain a piece of research for years and years and years, not questioning it, not addressing the very obvious loopholes in studies like that. So if experts can be fooled by experts, all of us can be, right? So how do we work through this? How can you tell your children, especially now, I think for a lot of you, school opens on the 15th of July, is what I'm told? For
I think it's different in different states.
different in different schools, but you're all online. My students have been online since March, and our school closes next week for summer. So how do you, in this situation, make sure that the online time spent by your children is productive, qualitative, and is not riddled with misinformation? The first thing is that you have to reflect on information yourself, right? And then teach your children to reflect on it. Analyze the information. Make your children read an opinion piece on a topic from The Guardian, from a right-wing website, from another website, news website like Al Jazeera, and compare the same piece of information and see how it's presented differently. That is a very important step towards media literacy. It helps you to understand, and it helps you to see that the same information can be presented so differently. We live in a very, very Eurocentric world. One of the things that I did again in school was for my English syllabus, I just removed every single American and European and English writer. So there was no Shakespeare, there was no William Wordsworth. My students had to look at Indian poets, they looked at African poets, they looked at Latin American authors and poets, to the point where one child said, I thought we were in an international school. Why are we only doing Indian poets? Right? And that really struck me. And for that moment, I was taken aback, but I explained it to him and I told him why we are not looking at Eurocentric poets. And then he was okay with it, but it's an initial bias that if I'm looking at poetry, if I'm looking at stories, I can only look at people like Shakespeare, Wordsworth, etc., right? When I do my creative writing classes with my students and they write stories, 9 out of 10, if they mention characters in their stories, it's always Emily and Jane and John and Robert, all names that our Indian students don't have a context for. So that is again something I need to explain to them and say, use Indian names, say Nikhil, say Krishna, look at your own classmates, Sri Vidya, use these names. And they are very uncomfortable with it. But after a bit of practice and a bit of understanding, it becomes okay. So reflect, research, and help your children resolve any kind of questions that they have, any kind of challenges that they feel and that they experience, right? You sit with your child or you yourself evaluate the reliability of the content. Not everything you read is reliable, no matter how well it is presented, right? So make sure that you do that. I don't actually want to go through these because I can share the presentation and it can be given to all of you. But these are just examples of what I want to show you, what I mean. That, see, for example, L'Oreal company claims they conducted clinical trials. The moment I read the word clinical trials, I think, yes, L'Oreal must be absolutely correct. If I use the cream, my wrinkles will go. All right, there's no scientific basis to that. So think each time you see something and you read something, challenge yourself to see the information you're getting is accurate or not. This is another exercise, but I'll take a pause and I want to hear from all of you. Have any of you done map exercises in geography to see whether the world map as we see it today is accurate or not? Anyone?
Yes,
we are very used.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me more about it.
Yeah. I mean, hello, good morning. I'm not a student. I'm an educationist and I've run schools. I'm still part of schools. Lots of things, Yasmin, you have said have struck a chord with me, and I'll just go a little earlier. It was very difficult to convince even a school board with IIMs and IITs to say that Khushwant Singh's Train from Pakistan is better to understand partition than anything else. Yes. And English learning without Shakespeare is almost considered to be, you are out of your mind. That's something which I have faced when I try to introduce both Khushwant Singh and R.K. Narayan and maybe Sudha Murthy into what we were doing. Yes. That's one. This geography exercise I have done, to my horror. Yes. South America became India and India became South America. We'll not go beyond that, but I have one additional point listening to your fascinating conversation about media literacy. I am in Bangalore. I know your school a little better. If you watch through news channels of Malayalam, Tamil, Kannada, Hindi and English, and if you use NDTV and maybe Arnab Goswami's famous Republic together, you can be more than sure that if you see 10 channels, you will have those 10 channels focuses different. And I've done a little study on it to see that Kashmir is so-called burning. I'm a soldier and I know what's happening in Ladakh. I have served there. But that becomes less important for a Kerala channel who's much more interested what the communists are doing.
Exactly.
And for us in Bangalore, as to why till class 4 online classes are not on. So the biases, etc., and the cognitive dissonance you talk about is so very real. And the second part of it about Google is 92% of us do not go beyond the second page of a Google review.
Exactly.
And the first 2 pages are so much sponsored that you have a Pushpaka Viman done before the Wright brothers found it, or Trump calling the birther movement, still people understanding it. Perhaps I believe the biggest challenge for educators like you and me is for this kind of thing to be sorted out. 2 plus 2 is not 4 but 22, because there is a theory behind it, is what we are going to face.
Exactly.
I just thought I'll share this with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And you're absolutely right. And as I had mentioned very early on, algorithms are a huge problem. And my expat white students, for want of a better word, were very angry when they said, Miss, how can we only see white people before we see a person of color in the different things that we are researching? So one girl said, let me type in pretty person. She typed in pretty person. She had to count before she came across any person of color. And she said, this is just so wrong. So in many ways, please know that a search engine is already biasing you. A search engine is already showing you what, maybe because as a result of a lot of people looking up a certain bit of information or biasing their searches in a certain way, things are being thrown up to you that's not accurate. If you type in poor person on Google, you're going to get Indians and Africans in the image search that you do, right? For some reason, you also see Donald Trump, and my students laugh their heads off over that. But, this is what I mean. Do this exercise yourselves. Just type in into your search engine actual size of countries and continents, and you'll be in for a huge surprise. You'll be in for a huge surprise, because the map that we see is a very Eurocentric interpretation of the world. And when you look at the actual sizes of countries versus what you're used to seeing in your geography classes, and it's something that is completely different. All right, just coming almost to the end of the presentation, and then we'll open to questions. How do I become an inquiring critical thinker? Please examine your cognitive biases. All of us have cognitive biases. Examine them. Question before you accept. At the end of 2 years of an IB education, all IB students, most of them, all is a bit of an exaggeration, do start questioning before they accept anything that is given to them. A lot of students who write back to me when they're in universities, they say, what we learned in our IB and the kind of absolute questioning and almost no tolerance towards having a biased point of view has really helped us become very good thinkers and fact checkers. So learn about your logical fallacies, examine the way you know. At the beginning of this presentation, I asked you, how do you know what you know, right? You know something as a result of a cognitive conclusion you've come to. You also know something as a result of an emotional conclusion you've come to. A lot of learning comes through emotion. A lot of learning comes through memory, stories that have been passed on in your families, in your culture, in your societies. There are many ways of knowing, right? You need to know what your strongest way of knowing is and try and see why you see the world through that lens. All right. Finally, just a very quick thing on digital safety for children. Again, because there's online instruction, and are they on multiple tabs, or are they actually doing the work they should do? So I want to begin with something that parents should not do. Please don't be overbearing in your internet monitoring. Our children are smarter. They are digital natives. They are a bit smarter than us. They know how to get around all kinds of restrictions that you create. Don't have that kind of a situation on your hands. Don't be overbearing. If you give them confidence and you show them that you have confidence in them, their online experience is going to be very, very different. All right? Please don't enforce and have terribly, strict online restrictions. Always go backfire, right? Don't always limit internet usage, because they will find ways and to rebel, just as any one of us would. I would if I was a student. And forbidding young people to hold social media accounts. I use the word young people here. Facebook and most social media platforms have an age limit before which you cannot join. But don't stop your teenager, for example, from having a social media account. Talk to them about it, interact with them about it. Don't force yourself to be on their friend list if they don't want you, but give them the confidence that you're there for them when they experience any kind of an uncomfortable situation on the internet, right? Make it fun, make it interactive, make it interesting. Interland is something that you can try. It's just a click away in search engines and you'll get it. It's a very first that's thrown up. It's a very interactive adventure game kind of platform that helps young people understand internet security. One thing that we tell our students is everything leaves a digital footprint. I'm amazed that children who are so good with technology, so in the know of all kinds of tech and social media related things, don't seem to realize the kind of digital footprint they leave, right? So you need to make them understand that, you need to make them mindful of it, right? We have experienced in my school, in the extended community, how some forms of cyberbullying have impacted children. So tell your children, tell your students, those of you who are teachers here, that words make an impact on the receiver, right? If I don't want to be trolled, if I don't want to be called names on social media, I should not do it either. Snapchat is a very problematic space in that sense, because a lot of words can be said and a lot of hurt can go around. All right? Think before you share. That goes for WhatsApp, that goes for things you share on social media platforms, and encourage your child to speak up. We very often have a tendency to say, just keep quiet, don't tell anyone, it's okay, no, don't create a problem. That is wrong. I think that needs to change. Encourage your child to speak up, to advocate for themselves. The more you encourage a child to advocate for themselves, the more confident, the more inquiring your child will become. These are a few sites that are excellent. You can take a screenshot of it if you want, or make a note of it. These help children understand and help them to be responsible digital citizens. These are good websites. I've looked at them myself. Okay, that's all from me, but we are all open to questions, and sometimes the best part of a presentation comes because of the questions asked.
Right. Thank you so much, Yasmin. That was interesting. Actually, if possible, I don't know if this is possible, there is a response from Sonia Devdatta on the chat saying the issue with sharing your screen is that you share your entire desktop at the outset. So if possible, you want to take us through the map exercise, maybe now is the time when I'm reading through questions. But okay. Just a reminder, please, there are no such things as stupid questions. Please go ahead and post your questions, and I'll be moderating these questions. One question I suppose people might ask Yasmin is, is it important to, you said don't be very hard on children and regulate their internet devices and being online. Would you say that offline is, reading books, even though books are very useful for other reasons? Would you say that there are easier ways to encourage children to go offline than online? And is there any bearing on media literacy?
So there, you see, it's not the easiest question to answer. How do I get my child offline? How do I make them interested in things? Some children are just not readers at all, right? So telling them to read a book or to reviewing books, of course, is one of the most tedious things a teacher can give a student. I have many alternatives to that, just if you're interested. But some of the things that have helped my students go offline and stay away from the internet is by asking them to create their own designs and create your own products. For example, if I teach them a poem or a story, and then I tell them, create a board game that reflects your understanding of this. Or if they've been taught a concept in science, create a board game. Or, hey, you are one of the greatest inventors and designers in this world. What is the next best physical game that you can create that's going to keep everyone engaged? So initially it's met with resistance, and they say, can we just open the internet just to get ideas? I said, that's not the point. No. All right, you cannot open the internet just to get ideas. All the ideas you have are in your brain. And I'm surprised to see something as casual as me saying your brain has got more ideas than the internet has such a positive effect on the students, because sometimes I think they genuinely didn't think that way, right? And they, for example, my student from Sweden created the most amazing science board game all on his own, only because, and his language isn't very strong, right? English is not his first language. But there you go, he was engaged. So think about creative ways to keep your child engaged offline. I can give you tips later if you want.
Okay, there is JJ has asked a question. JJ, would you like to try asking your question yourself? And after JJ, we can go to Yasmin, and from there to Joshua.
Hi, Yasmin, thanks for the wonderful session. So you mentioned about Snapchat, and it came to my mind a few days back. One of my friend, he asked me that his 12-year-old daughter is actually on all these platforms, WhatsApp, Facebook, through her mother's phone. And so this 12-year-old girl has come under tremendous peer pressure to be on Snapchat. And this was worrying my friend, because all the other platforms he said he can manage, but Snapchat he was not sure because of some of the horrific stories he's heard in the past. So how do you, what do you suggest in, how do you draw the line for kids, obviously, pre-teenage, but it's difficult to say that don't join something, but they will either ways find some way to join the platform. Thank you.
Yeah. So don't begin with resistance, right? By the time you come to the stage where you have to tell your child, don't use Snapchat, if you haven't given your child a safe space, that is not to say that this parent hasn't, but in my experience, you need to give a child a safe space already to talk about, to share stuff, draw very clear boundaries of what kind of interactions you expect a child to have versus what you don't expect a child to have in general, right? So that by the time it comes to saying no, Snapchat is where I draw the line, this child has understood boundaries, has respected boundaries, and has realized why this is something that might be detrimental to them or to her, even though all her friends are on it. It's very easy to say this, it's very difficult to translate into actuality, but it does, you have to work a lot before that in building a relationship of trust, of confidence, of in addition to understanding that there are boundaries that every child has to respect. So Joshua says we should keep an open mind always. Open, inquiring, critical thinking mind, Joshua, right? Don't keep it open for other influences to come in, but you have to be a critical thinker, all right? Yamini wants to know more about digital footprints, all right? So this is, I'll tell this to you through an amusing sort of example. Many months ago, I had bought a simple necklace from one of these fancy online sites. And a few days later, I had bought a skirt from Fab India, all online. This was sometime last year, right? Of course, it started showing up on my Facebook feed, and you can buy more necklaces, and they showed me examples and other dresses. And this is pure coincidence, it's not like they have actual digital spy cams on us, but the day I wore the necklace and the skirt was the day that I saw the skirt, the very skirt I had bought, being worn by the model. So I found that extremely amusing, but it did drive home the point that everything on the internet leaves a trace. You go to a certain website, you go somewhere, it has left a trace, you can be traced back to that. all right? And that's important it's important that you tell children that, because they could be misled into going to websites that are not good for them, or clicking on pop-up ads that promise them all kinds of things. You leave a trace. Now, the technical part of it, I'm not qualified to speak about, like what exactly happens, how exactly can I be traced back? That would require an expert. But know that if your online presence is noted. Saurabh is a former friend and colleague of mine, excellent teacher, fantastic digital media person also. Saurabh, please tell us about the study.
Well, not so fantastic a digital media person as you. So the map thing I wanted to tell you, yes, we did it as part of TOK, and that was a revelation to the students. I wanted to share this with you because now I'm teaching global perspectives. And so I was looking at one of the topics that I did with grade 8 global perspectives was to look at social media. And then I came across this research study that CNN had sponsored in 2015, hashtag being 13, you can have a look at that, which actually revealed to a whole lot of parents the secret lives of their teenagers. One point that came to my attention, and which is very relevant and which totally you're spot on, is that parents who had built that safe space with their children so that their children added them to their social networks, they were able to control the damage or the outcome of online cyberbullying, because they were already in that space and they could see that my child is being bullied. So they were able to help their children overcome that loss of self-esteem, etc., which their peers often inflict on them in the cyberspace.
Yes, absolutely, Saurabh. And I can't emphasize more how important it is for parents to build a safe space, because like I said, please know that your children know their way around social media far better than you do, all right? So the only way you can work around that is by being a safe ally to them and not a threatening presence who restricts and stops and scolds them, because they will work their way around it no matter what, all right? Another question is that we live in the country which has a majority religion, and because of this scenario, is it not easy to have biases against people? How do we overcome these biases, religious biases, dislike of one community towards another? Again, the first thing is be aware, right? Even the slightest bit of bias, it's an in-group, out-group thing, to give it a very psychology-related term. If I will defend my group, I will protect my group, and I will look at those who are not a part of my group as an outsider, as others, as people who I cannot trust. All right? So the first thing that you need to do is be aware. Think, wait a minute, I'm thinking this way. That surely is a bias, right? All Muslims are terrorists. Hang on, that's a bias, right? Why am I thinking that way? Because I get so many WhatsApp forwards. Because I've heard it from my childhood. Because so many people tell me that. All right, but what do I think? Let me examine this question. Let me look at it, through a very critical, objective, scientific lens. The only solution to that is each one of us work to break down our biases. I had to work to break down a lot of biases too. It's not been easy, but I'm getting there. So it's a challenge, but challenge yourselves to do that.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question on that. Can I?
Yes. Sorry, Shekhar.
Yeah. This business of the Hindu, the Muslim biases, they are much tougher than you can ever imagine as of now. Maybe you are living in an international space. Despite everything else, with the national leaders and international leaders talking this language, our problem is less to do with truth or lies. It normally comes about, as Harry Frankfurt says, with bullshit, a mixture of the ideal truth and lies coming together. And fortunately, as a service officer on those communal things, I was able to go ahead of it. But the biases people have towards religion, as well as the caste-based mental algorithms they themselves have, is among the toughest with the media biases which we inherently have.
Yes.
We
Yes.
have, yeah, it is something which I personally would say we have had only limited success in doing it. I would wish to know from you what are the things which you have tried. Some we have succeeded, some we have lost, but it's becoming an increasingly difficult challenge to face.
So, we in school, in my teaching, I have experienced children facing these biases, asking or using this bias they have against other children. And the most important thing, I know as a teacher, for me to say these things are extremely easy because I do come with a certain degree of objectivity, but you have to allow children to speak about these issues, to discuss these issues. I remember that when Trump won the election, and my American colleague, she, as well, everyone should be, is very, very against the philosophies and the policies of Donald Trump. And she said, "Oh no, oh my God, this is the worst thing that has happened. I can't teach for the rest of the day." And that day, our whole school was sort of more checking the poll results than anything else. And we did have a few students who were very pro-Trump, and they were celebrating. So of course, the next day we had a TOK class where we addressed this, and we allowed this person who was a very, very ardent Trump supporter to speak. We let students who maybe did not know much about American politics to speak, and American students who were against Trump to speak. So when two extremes and a middle group got a chance, got a platform, a non-judgmental platform. I mean, both Amy and I had to sort of hold our own biases and prejudices and anger behind and let children talk as they wanted to. But at the end of that 1 hour, it's not like the Trump supporter became a Trump hater, but at least respect the perspective, genuinely respect. I don't like that word tolerate, but they genuinely began to respect the point of view of others. So always let children speak, let children challenge each other. If they say something out and out hurtful and demeaning to people belong to communities, to castes, and to religions, challenge them on that also, right? For example, I had to challenge a student in my middle school who said, "Oh, I don't like Indians, and India is so dirty, and I don't like being in India at all." And I said, "Okay, let's talk about it." And for the rest of the class, we spoke about it. And he wasn't the same boy who had said all those hurtful things. And it really, I was angry and I was upset. And I said, "I hope I don't cry." But for the rest of the year, I was looking at a different boy because he was given a voice to speak and because children had an interactive discussion with him. So let people share information, discuss it, evaluate it critically, inform people. Like you said, Colonel, it's a very, very, very difficult thing to do. We are very culturally entrenched, but maybe small steps. Small steps.
Yeah, Yasmin, I don't know if you can hear me. Rijul Kaushal, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Rijul, is asking a question about views about the online teaching going on nowadays.
I can see.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think Rijul has asked this question for a second time, and I just wanted to make sure.
No, Rijul, I'll address it. So I know that online teaching was thrown in the face of both teachers, parents, and students this March, and everyone was at sea. But what do I personally think of online teaching? May not be a view that everybody else shares, but I do think online teaching is going to be the way of the future, right? It is going to mean a lot more screen time, which comes with all the negatives of that. We have to be prepared for a world where online teaching and school-based teaching becomes increasingly common. My middle school IB program already is online. Grade 10 exams are online. This year, exams were cancelled for everyone, but who knows, next year, maybe exams may be online too. So I think it has its value. I'm not going to say that it completely replaces a physical teacher in a physical classroom, but you are going to look at a mix of the two. So the more we are ready for it, the better.
How do you talk about confirmation bias? What is confirmation bias? It's pretty clear to me now after many years of thinking about it, but is there any way you would explain it?
So confirmation bias is, again, something I teach both in psychology and in theory of knowledge. You're very simply put, without putting all the technicalities to it, you only look at information that agrees with your opinion or your belief system, and you disregard things that don't. So, for example, and with all respect to everyone who have different beliefs from me, this is an exercise that I do in my theory of knowledge class, right? So I talk to them about various kinds of, how do I put it, people who claim to have clairvoyant abilities, or people who claim to have experienced supernatural events, right? Now, I always tell my students before I begin the class that we respect each other's religions, whether we have faith in them or not. But some of these exercises are necessary for us to understand where biases come from. So we were talking about ghosts and the supernatural, and the girl said, "But miss, I totally believe in ghosts because my parents have told me this." So we looked a little deeper into that, but all she was doing, and she said, "Wait, I'll research. I know, miss, you want me to research." So she started doing research, and in the 15 minutes that she researched, she just showed me instances of websites, of proper abstract filled articles of encounters with the supernatural. But another girl who did not, or at least questioned supernatural activity, showed her the opposite. So this was, sort of a clash. She did experience cognitive dissonance, but initially she was only looking at information bias. So, while this is a great fun exercise in TOK, in reality, the way when we translate it and we only look at news articles that confirm our beliefs, or political ideas and WhatsApp forwards that confirm our beliefs, I think we need to put a red flag alert in our own brains and say, hang on, is this confirmation bias? Because admitting that to yourself is very difficult, right? Because it's a bruised ego then. That, oh, okay,
right.
Fine, I was a fool.
Yes, yeah. Indeed. So much to tackle, Yasmin.
Oh,
one last question, and maybe any concluding thoughts from you is, I think.
I wanted to ask a question. This is Shalini Mittal here.
Go ahead, Shalini.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think I'd just like to start that I'm representing a group of students who are not on the online. We have schools running in rural locations where this whole digital thing has not reached them for the simple reason of lack of hardware and software and connectivity, etc. But with the coming in of this COVID and not being left choice, we are connecting. Our teachers are having to come onto this whole digital platform, and we have no choice but to try and see how we are moving towards, or we're getting we kind of thinking that yes, now this whole online thing is something that we will also need to see for our students.
Yes.
But at the same time, given what all one hears about the cons of this entire thing and this whole like we're saying, digital literacy, I'm very nervous pushing our students. Yes, they're out of that whole mainstream, but if they're having to come on to this whole digital thing, what as an organization do we need to be alert about, so that maybe we can put checks and balances in place, and we can try and maybe minimize the damages, because they have not yet been exposed to all of this. Right. So what is it that organizations like us that are working in rural areas at the grassroots level, where digitization has not yet become the primary sort of thing for, I mean, for functioning for life in general, it's become. So on the teaching front, while we are having to move on to that, what can we put in place, or what can we be alert about as educators, as an organization, that these devastating effects get minimized?
So, if you haven't already, you must have a very strong child protection policy, right? And if you already have a child protection policy, include digital literacy and digital citizenship in it. For that, the first thing that you will have to do is undergo some kind of training. And there are lots of free websites. If you give me some time to research, and if you leave an email somewhere, I can send you those links where you can very quickly learn what digital literacy is from the point of view of an educator, right? And then you must sit with your teachers and create a policy. I can't emphasize that more. It just takes one thing to go wrong for everything to collapse. Have a policy that very clearly lists out child safety, child protection issues using the internet. I can probably take permission from my school and ask them if I can show you samples of what we do. There's also something called a child protection course that is there for educators that you can probably go, you take, you also get a certification for it. So there are lots of options. And I don't know if you've heard of Mekshala.
No, I haven't. No.
Oh, wonderful. Because you're in for a very happy surprise. Mekshala is a digital Mekshala, cloud school. It's a digital platform started by a lady called Jyoti Tyagarajan. You can look it up, where they provide free lessons in all the subjects for children in government schools. And these lessons are created by top educators. Jyoti herself is an international educator, a former Aditi teacher. So look it up, Mekshala. You will.
Would this be in Hindi? Would this be in Hindi?
Yes, it's in Hindi too. Okay. It's in Hindi as well.
Okay,
so that
thank
should
you for that.
Immediately address it'll address 90% of your issues with how do I teach someone online, because you get it ready and it's free.
Great, thank you.
Right. I think, Yasmin, we just completely run out of time. There are still 2-3 questions. If you have the time, you can take them up. Otherwise, I leave it up to you, but not more than that. Nisha Rao has a question.
Nisha, why do some people believe any and all information they see without any bias? That's a difficult question to answer. In many ways, I've never been taught to question, right? I lived in an ashram in my childhood and was in a school where we were told not to question, right? You have to believe everything that's told to you, no questioning it. You dare not question. So for the longest time, I believed everything, right? It took me a lot of reflection and a lot of thinking to move away from that way of thinking. But perhaps they've never really had the experience of being inquirers. That's all I can say. Even in rural areas, government school teachers are sending lessons. Yeah. Everyone try Mekshala, get in touch. They have a Facebook page. They will help you. Anyone who is an educator and is having problems sending content online, please go to Mekshala. Have I missed any more questions?
I think we're all set. We're fine.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get kicked out of Zoom if we don't end.
No, we won't. We won't get kicked out. But if you have any, I'm just going to scroll one more time for questions. But otherwise, I think if you have any concluding remarks to make, now's a good time.
Well, all I want to say to you all is what I tell my students, what I'm sure Saurabh as a fellow educator also tells the students is, be critical thinkers, be inquirers, don't take things at face value, always question and be an informed reader.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks very, very much. Jency Jacob is our managing editor. Jency, if you have any words to say, please go ahead. But before that, I'll just thank everybody. And Yasmin, in particular to you, this is a fantastic session. We will have a recording of this made available on YouTube, and we'll send you all an email with that link. And of course, Yasmin Clare is someone you should look up on social media and find out more about her work. And also, please do the same for Boom. We are in the business of fact-checking, of course. Many of you know that, but we're also increasingly getting into media literacy as well. So please consider looking at our website. And thank you all. Jency, it's over to you.
Yasmin, thank you for speaking to us. It was a great pleasure to hear you on media literacy. And actually, I also thought that we moved a lot into safety, and you answered all the questions pretty well. So thank you for once again, spending time with us, and also all the other participants. Do support us at Boom by reading our stories and sharing it on WhatsApp. I think you can share more verified facts on WhatsApp and all the other platforms that you're on, and tell people to read us, because this is what we do day in and day out. We don't write any page view stories for page views or viral stories. We only do fact checking. Sorry, that's my plug for Boom. But once again, Yasmin, thank you, and Venkatesh, thank you for moderating this.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being such good participants.
Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you, Saurabh.
Thank you all. Thank you all.